Well, howdy there. Today I'll argue against political violence, particularly why you, yes, you, dear viewer, should restrain the urge to punch a Nazi. First, due to the sensitive nature of the topic, I would like to begin by making it explicitly clear that I deplore Nazism. In no way is this video a defense of their ideology or political tactics. Nazism is of course an evil, vile, disgusting ideology which perpetuates racist eugenics and resulted in more than 21 million murders since the 1930s. It is an ideology that obviously deserves to be confronted and combated wherever it is present. The question is not whether to combat Nazism, but rather what is the most effective and appropriate way to do so. I would like to further constrain my argument by saying that political violence can, at times, be justified. If Nazis have taken over the state and modified the institutions to assure their ascendancy, punch a Nazi. If Nazis are perpetuating a genocide, punch a Nazi. If Nazis are in the process of committing a hate crime or violent crime of any type, go ahead and punch a Nazi. If, however, the Nazis make up a fringe political group whose sole transgression is espousing their disgusting and vile ideology, then don't punch a Nazi. Let me then begin by telling you how this topic arose. We were having a discussion about the U.S. Constitution at my college when a member of the administration suggested that we should amend the Constitution so as to allow for the punching of Nazis. In fairness, I should note that it was unclear whether the argument was made earnestly or simply in the name of discussion. Yet the far more concerning outcome of the argument was that no other person among the 20 or so students involved in the discussion seemed to see a problem with enshrining a right to commit an act of violence upon a fellow citizen based solely on ideological differences in the highest law of the land. I was then, and continue to be now, appalled by the argument, and so set out to present a case against it. This argument is of course not new. In recent history, perhaps the most famous example of its use was when actor David Harbour, who plays Jim Hopper on Stranger Things, declared his willingness to punch Nazis, to the apparent bewilderment of his fellow cast member Winona Ryder while they were receiving an award. And this apparent popularity presents all the more reason to oppose the argument. The idea that ideological disagreements, even of the most severe kind, cause harm, are therefore akin to violence, and ergo should be met with actual violence, is not just wrong, but is antithetical to the very idea of ordered liberty. We have long held that free speech and the freedom of expression are essential to the preservation of a free society. In fact, when the founders began listing the rights necessary to a free society, this was literally the first one. The First Amendment protects freedoms of speech, the press, religion, assembly, and petition, which, when taken together, constitute above all a freedom of thought. However, I recognize that it is difficult to see how an ideology so opposed to the operation of a free society as Nazism is, could be essential to its preservation. And in fact, that's not the argument I believe or intend to make. It is not Nazism, but rather the principle of freedom of thought, which is essential to the concept of ordered liberty. To advocate violence against any person purely for their ideological thought, rather than for their actions, can be intended to send only a single message: you are not allowed to think this way. While I wholeheartedly believe that no one should be a Nazi, that is an entirely different statement than saying that no one should be allowed to be a Nazi. Among my plethora of disagreements with Nazism, its willingness to suppress the viewpoints of all who would oppose them is certainly one. It is a mistake, and it is a mistake that I think we should be unwilling to replicate ourselves. If Nazism is as inferior an idea as we believe it to be, we should be able to keep it from obtaining any real political power the old-fashioned way, through vigilance and debate. Let no Nazi premise go unchallenged, and no Nazi argument go unanswered. And when they commit crimes, let no Nazi crime go unprosecuted. Yet, to do violence ourselves, merely based on their ideological beliefs, betrays that we do not believe in our own ability to suppress their organization through the use of reason and argumentation. There are only two reasons that could be. Either we doubt our own abilities to debunk their arguments, in which case we should likely be re-examining our own ideology, or we doubt the motives of a large enough portion of our countrymen that we feel resorting to violence is the only way to keep Nazi ideology from gaining power, in which case we should doubt whether or not we truly have a country. I fear the motive for wanting to punch Nazis comes very much from the latter camp. Do we have so little faith in our fellow Americans that we think them so easily persuaded into the arms of Nazis? And yet, even if we do, this is not a problem that can be solved through individual violence. Such violence is much more likely to radicalize others in defense of those who are assaulted than it is to put an end to Nazism. This is, naturally, not the first time in our history in which we have had to discuss the protection of speech which seems irreconcilable with our systems of governance. Indeed, it is not the first time we have had to discuss the protection of Nazi speech, which we found deplorable. The most famous example of this very discussion occurred before the Supreme Court in 1977 in a case called the National Socialist Party of America versus the village of Skokie. In the case, a group of self-identified Nazis planned to march through a neighborhood populated largely by Jewish Holocaust survivors, wearing swastikas and traditional Nazi uniforms. The Illinois courts said that the potential for violence inherent in the act gave them the right to prevent the march. But the Supreme Court disagreed, holding that in spite of the undesirable connotation and location of the speech, it was nonetheless protected by the First Amendment. Which brings us to the true crux of the issue. Is the First Amendment protection of all ideological speech correct? In short, the answer is yes, even when that answer is painful. The reason it is correct is that if the answer is in any part no, and not all ideological speech is protected, the inherent next question is which ideological speech is not included. In the notion of punching Nazis, we have a fairly clear answer. Nazi speech is not protected, and yet even this simple answer is rife with problems. Is all speech by people identified as Nazis not protected? Or only speech which is related to their Nazi ideology? The former is, of course, overly broad. but both would necessitate someone to define the bounds of Nazi ideology other than the Nazis themselves, either to decide who is a Nazi or to decide which speech is Nazi speech. The breadth of this problem can be immediately acknowledged just by considering the broad array of public figures in the United States who have been accused for various reasons of Nazism. They include former President Donald Trump, current Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and TV personalities like Tucker Carlson. Similarly, comparisons have been made between the current FBI and Nazi raids, and accusations have been leveled at Democratic mayors who have witnessed anti-Semitic hate crime spike in their cities. In my opinion, all of these accusations are overbroad, but the problem remains. If we are going to start punching Nazis, who gets to decide who the Nazis are that we're going to punch? In a highly polarized political climate, such as the one we have now, the answer is clear. As we have repeatedly seen, anyone I dislike doing anything I disagree with is a Nazi. This doesn't mean that real Nazism doesn't exist, but we must be much more careful in defining our terms if we are going to begin openly advocating for violence. My final argument is, why just Nazis? If we are going to advocate political violence, surely we should do so against the most egregious group which is most likely to gain power within the American system, right? Communism has traditionally been viewed as just as despicable as Nazism, at least within the United States. And rightly so. If we are arguing based on death figures, communists killed over 35 million people in China alone in the 20th century, with the Soviets adding another 61 million. If the abhorrence of an ideology should be laid at the feet of its death toll, we should certainly be punching communists as well as Nazis. And yet, somehow, I highly doubt that many in the Punch a Nazi Club would be signing up to deck commies. We have to suppose, then, that there is something uniquely evil about Nazism, even apart from its history. However, violence against Nazis, no matter how we define them, would still fail to offer a solution. Because even by this logic, it is not Nazism per se which is the root of the evil we seek to combat. There seem to be 4 chief ideological components of Nazism, which are both prevalent and so morally outrageous as to inspire violent tendencies: racism, eugenics, fascism, and dictatorship. There are almost certainly more, but these 4 seemed the most readily identifiable. None of these 4 components are unique in any way to Nazi ideology, and forms of all of them can be found in extremist beliefs on both sides of the American political spectrum. So perhaps we should pummel extremists of all types then. But this only serves to further expose the main definitional problem. Punch a Nazi is shorthand for in-group, out-group, us versus them violence, and it is made exponentially worse by ill-defined categories. The American political scene has suffered a great number of indignities, but if we are now willing to abandon an ideal so core to our society as the freedom of speech in favor of punishing views which we find to be unacceptable, then I'm afraid we have forgotten the lessons of the founding. A core tenet of liberalism in the United States used to be, I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. A statement with which I agree. But the messaging of today seems to be rather, if I am offended by your ideals, that is a violence to be reciprocated. And that is a slogan which can ultimately only lead to widespread tribal violence and societal dissolution. In the words of the American Civil Liberties Union, with whom I regularly disagree, if we do not come to the defense of the free speech rights of the most unpopular among us, even if their views are antithetical to the very freedom the First Amendment stands for, then no one's liberty will be secure. In that sense, all First Amendment rights are indivisible. Censoring so-called hate speech also runs counter to the long-term interests of the most frequent victims of hate: racial, ethnic, religious, and sexual minorities. We should not give the government the power to decide which opinions are hateful, for history has taught us that government is more apt to use this power to prosecute minorities than to protect them. As one federal judge has put it, tolerating hateful speech is the best protection we have against any Nazi-type regime in this country. If we want to defeat Nazis, then we must debate them, not punch them. And with that, I cast you back into the void.